There comes a painful moment in spiritual awakening when a person walks into a crowded room and suddenly realizes they can no longer breathe inside conversations that once felt normal. The laughter sounds rehearsed, the smiles feel borrowed, the energy feels heavy, even when everyone is pretending to enjoy themselves. What once distracted them now exhausts them. What once entertained them now feels emotionally empty. And this shift confuses people around them because from the outside, it looks like withdrawal, arrogance, or sadness, but internally something far deeper is happening. The soul is rejecting what the nervous system once tolerated for survival. Spiritually awake people begin to recognize how much of social life is built upon performance rather than presence. They notice how often people speak without revealing themselves, how conversations revolve around appearances, status, gossip, comparison, and carefully edited identities. They notice how rare it is for someone to truly ask, "How are you?" and actually remain long enough to hear the answer. And once a person sees this clearly, they cannot unsee it. The illusion begins to crack everywhere. They stop finding comfort in environments where everyone is talking but nobody is connecting. They become deeply sensitive to emotional dishonesty. Even small interactions start to feel draining because spiritually awake people no longer consume words alone. They feel energy underneath words. They can sense resentment hidden behind compliments. They can feel insecurity disguised as confidence. They can hear pain buried beneath someone's constant joking. And this heightened awareness changes everything because now socializing is no longer casual stimulation. It becomes emotional exposure. What most people call fun often feels like emotional noise to an awakened person, not because they believe they are better than others, but because their inner world has become too conscious to tolerate constant disconnection from truth. Their nervous system begins craving depth the way starving lungs crave oxygen. Small talk starts feeling physically exhausting because the soul becomes tired of performing emotions it no longer genuinely feels. Many spiritually awake people spent years becoming whoever others needed them to be. They learned early that acceptance often required self-betrayal, so they mastered the art of SMI, playing while hurting, agreeing while uncomfortable, entertaining while emotionally empty. They became emotionally adaptive to survive relationships, families, workplaces, and communities where authenticity was unsafe. But awakening destroys this survival strategy. It forces a person to feel the unbearable weight of how often they abandon themselves just to remain accepted. And once someone begins reconnecting with their authentic self, performative socializing becomes almost painful. They can no longer sit through conversations where everyone competes for validation while secretly feeling inadequate inside. They can no longer tolerate friendships built entirely on distraction instead of emotional honesty. They become allergic to emotional shallowness because their spirit is starving for something real. This is why spiritually awake people often stay home. Home becomes the only place where they no longer have to fragment themselves into socially acceptable versions. Solitude becomes sacred because it is the one environment where the nervous system finally stops bracing itself. No pretending, no performing, no monitoring facial expressions, no shrinking truth to protect fragile egos, no forcing energy they do not genuinely have. People misunderstand this withdrawal because society worships social visibility. If someone constantly goes out, stays busy, posts photos, attends gatherings, and remains socially active, they are considered healthy and successful. But spiritually awake people begin realizing that constant social stimulation can become a sophisticated form of self-avoidance. Many people stay surrounded by noise because silence would force them to meet themselves. Silence would expose their grief, their loneliness, their fear, their emptiness, their unresolved pain. Awakened people are no longer willing to run from themselves in that way. They begin choosing environments that nourish their nervous system instead of depleting it. They become selective with energy because they finally understand that not every connection is healthy simply because it exists. They stop romanticizing access. They stop believing they owe everyone their emotional presence. They stop sacrificing inner peace just to avoid disappointing others. And this transformation often comes with deep loneliness at first, because when a person stops performing, many relationships begin to fade naturally. Some people were never connected to the real person beneath the mask. They were connected to the version that entertained them, comforted them, validated them, or remained emotionally convenient. So when spiritually awake people become quieter, more intentional, more honest, others sometimes accuse them of changing. But the truth is, they are finally becoming real. They are finally listening to the exhaustion their body carried for years. They are finally acknowledging how overstimulated they became from constantly absorbing the emotional chaos of others. They are finally respecting the sensitivity they once judged as weakness. Because spiritual awakening is not becoming emotionless, it is becoming unable to tolerate emotional dishonesty within yourself. There is also grief inside this awakening, deep grief. Because spiritually awake people begin realizing how much human connection is built upon unconscious roles instead of authentic intimacy. They mourn conversations that never reached the heart, relationships that survived only through suppression, communities built around image instead of truth. They begin noticing how rare it is for people to sit together without PR, attending, and this awareness changes their relationship with solitude forever. Alone no longer means abandoned. Alone begins to feel clean, peaceful, honest, safe. For the first time in their life, they experience moments where their nervous system is not preparing for emotional labor. They sit in silence and realize how long they lived, disconnected from themselves. They begin hearing their own thoughts clearly without society interrupting them. They rediscover emotions buried beneath years of overstimulation. Creativity returns, intuition sharpens, the body softens, the soul exhales. This is why spiritually awake people sometimes disappear from crowded spaces, not because they hate humanity, but because they can finally feel the psychological cost of constantly betraying their own energy. They understand now that every forced interaction leaves residue on the nervous system. Every performative conversation creates internal fatigue. Every moment spent abandoning authenticity weakens the spirit a little more. So they become intentional. They start valuing one honest conversation more than 100 empty interactions. They crave eye contact that feels human instead of strategic. The why seek people who speak from self-awareness rather than ego performance. They no longer care about being socially impressive because awakening dismantles the addiction to external validation. And eventually they discover something life-changing. Peace was never hiding inside crowds. It was waiting underneath the masks they finally stopped wearing. There is a kind of silence that terrifies people who have spent their entire lives surviving through distraction. The moment the noise disappears, the unresolved pain finally begins to speak. This is why so many people fear being alone. Not because solitude itself is painful, but because solitude removes every escape route from themselves. The phone becomes quiet. The conversations stop. The performance ends. And suddenly a person is left sitting in the presence of emotions they spent years trying not to feel. But spiritually awake people eventually discover something life-changing inside that silence. They discover that solitude is not punishment. It is recovery. It is the first safe place their nervous system has ever truly known. For years, many spiritually awake people lived in a constant state of emotional overexposure. They absorbed the moods of everyone around them. They carried tensions that were never theirs. They became caretakers, peacekeepers, emotional rescuers, listeners, protectors, performers. They learned how to stay emotionally available for everyone except themselves. And because this pattern often begins in childhood, they mistake emotional exhaustion for love. They mistake self-abandonment for connection. They mistake overgiving for worthiness. Then one day, the soul can no longer tolerate it. The body becomes tired in ways sleep cannot fix. Social interaction starts feeling heavy. Noise becomes overwhelming. Crowds feel invasive. Even simple conversations begin draining energy instead of creating it. And most people around them misunderstand this transformation. They assume something is wrong. They think the person has become antisocial, depressed, distant, or cold. But what is actually happening is sacred. The nervous system is finally demanding rest from a lifetime of emotional survival. Spiritually awake people do not stay home because they hate people. They stay home because their inner world has become too fragile to keep surviving environments that constantly disconnect them from themselves. Solitude becomes the place where they finally hear their own emotions without interruption. And at first this can feel unbearable. Because silence reveals everything. It reveals how much grief was hidden beneath constant busyness. It reveals how lonely they felt even while surrounded by people. It reveals how often they ignored their intuition just to avoid rejection. It reveals the childhood wounds they covered with productivity, relationships, entertainment, caretaking, or achievement. Solitude strips away distractions until a person can no longer escape their own truth. This is why awakening often feels lonely before it feels peaceful. When spiritually awake people first enter solitude, they often meet pain they postponed for years. Memories return. Suppressed emotions rise. Tears appear without warning. The body begins releasing tension that had been trapped inside for decades. And because society teaches people to fear discomfort, many run back toward noise before the healing can happen. They return to overstimulation because emptiness feels terrifying when you have never learned how to sit with yourself compassionately. But awakened people stay, even when the silence hates you, RTs, even when loneliness shakes them, even when old wounds begin surfacing, because somewhere deep inside they know this pain is not destroying them. It is finally introducing them to themselves, and slowly solitude begins changing its shape. What once felt empty begins feeling spacious. What once felt lonely begins feeling safe. For the first time in their lives, they experience moments where nobody is demanding emotional labor from them. Nobody needs them to perform happiness. Nobody expects them to shrink their truth. Nobody is feeding on their energy while ignoring their humanity. In solitude, they finally stop monitoring the emotional temperature of everyone else in the room. Their body softens, their breathing deepens, their thoughts slow down. They begin reconnecting with parts of themselves they abandoned long ago: the creative part, the intuitive part, the playful part, the exhausted child beneath the adult survival mask. And this reconnection feels almost spiritual because many awakened people spend so much of life adapting themselves to external expectations that they completely lost contact with their authentic identity. Solitude becomes the bridge back home to them. Elves, they begin noticing small things again: the peace of early mornings, the comfort of silence, the healing power of music, the way sunlight enters a quiet room, the feeling of drinking tea without rushing, the sound of their own thoughts becoming clearer. And what surprises them most is realizing how deeply they were craving this all along. Not attention, not validation, not constant social interaction. Peace, real peace, the kind that does not depend on being accepted by others, the kind that exists when the nervous system no longer feels hunted by pressure, performance, or emotional chaos. This is why spiritually awake people often protect their solitude fiercely. They understand now that energy is sacred. They understand that not every invitation deserves access to their nervous system. They understand that healing requires space. And perhaps most importantly, they understand that being alone and being lonely are not the same thing. Some people feel lonely in crowded marriages, lonely in friendships, lonely at parties, lonely while surrounded by attention. Because loneliness is not the absence of people, it is the absence of genuine connection. And spiritually awake people would rather sit alone in truth than surround themselves with relationships that require self-betrayal to maintain. There is enormous courage in reaching that point, because society rewards constant availability. It praises people who stay accessible, productive, entertaining, responsive, and socially engaged at all times. But awakened people begin realizing that endless accessibility often destroys inner peace. They stop treating their emotional energy like public property. They become intentional about who enters their space because they finally understand how deeply environments affect the human spirit. And over time, solitude no longer feels like isolation. It begins feeling like protection, like medicine, like emotional rehabilitation after years of internal neglect. In solitude, they learn how to hear themselves again. They learn what they truly feel instead of what they were conditioned to feel. They learn to rest without guilt. They learn to exist without performing. They learn that their worth does not increase through productivity or social approval. And perhaps the most healing realization of all begins to emerge quietly inside them. The reason silence once felt uncomfortable was because they spent their entire lives disconnected from themselves. Now silence feels sacred because they are finally in the presence of someone they abandoned for too long, their own soul. There comes a moment in spiritual awakening when a person becomes exhausted from managing how they appear to others. They begin realizing how much of their life was spent performing emotional stability while silently drowning inside, smiling while overwhelmed, saying "I'm fine" while emotionally collapsing, remaining agreeable while betraying their own boundaries. And eventually the soul reaches a breaking point where maintaining an image becomes more painful than telling the truth. This is the moment awakened people begin protecting their inner world more than their social image, because they finally understand something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. A person can be admired by everyone and still be deeply disconnected from themselves. Spiritually awake people begin noticing how much human behavior is driven by the fear of rejection. People shape personalities around acceptance. They suppress emotions to remain likable. They hide pain to appear strong. They silence truth to avoid conflict. They become experts at managing perception while their inner world quietly deteriorates beneath the surface. And the tragedy is that society rewards this performance. People are praised for being easygoing even when they are emotionally exhausted. They are admired for being selfless while neglecting themselves completely. They are celebrated for productivity while their nervous system is collapsing under pressure. The world often teaches human beings to abandon authenticity in exchange for approval. But awakening disrupts this entire pattern, because spiritually awake people begin feeling the psychological violence of self-betrayal. They realize how deeply exhausting it is to constantly monitor how they are perceived, how draining it feels to shape every word, every emotion, every reaction around external validation. They begin noticing that the obsession with image creates a prison where a person no longer knows who they truly are beneath everyone else's expectations. And slowly, something inside them changes. They stop asking, "Will people approve of me?" and start asking, "Does this betray my peace?" That question transforms everything. Suddenly, they no longer tolerate relationships where they must suppress themselves to remain accepted. They stop over-explaining boundaries to people committed to misunderstanding them. They stop chasing invitations into spaces that require emotional dishonesty. They stop performing happiness for audiences who never cared about their healing. Because awakened people eventually realize that protecting inner peace is not selfish, it is survival. Many spiritually awake people grew up in environments where image mattered more than emotional truth, families that cared about appearances more than feelings, communities that valued obedience more than authenticity, relationships where maintaining harmony required silence. So they learned early that love often came with conditions. Be good, be useful, be agreeable, be impressive, be easy to manage, but never be fully yourself. This conditioning creates adults who become deeply disconnected from their own emotional needs, adults who apologize for having boundaries, adults who fear disappointing others more than abandoning themselves, adults who feel guilty resting, speaking honestly, or protecting their energy. Awakening begins when the soul becomes too tired to continue living this way. And once this shift happens, spiritually awake people start guarding their inner world with extraordinary intention, not because they think they are superior, but because they finally understand how fragile peace actually is. They know one manipulative conversation can disturb the nervous system for days. One toxic environment can reactivate old survival patterns. One emotionally draining relationship can slowly disconnect them from themselves again. So they become careful, deliberate, selective. They stop giving everyone unlimited access to their emotional energy. This often confuses people, especially those who benefited from their lack of boundaries. People may accuse them of changing, becoming distant, becoming selfish, becoming cold. But what others call selfishness is often the first healthy boundary an awakened person has ever created. Because spiritually awake people finally realize they cannot heal while remaining constantly available to environments that damage their spirit. They begin choosing peace over popularity, truth over approval, authenticity over admiration. And this choice comes with enormous loneliness sometimes because the world is dead, deeply uncomfortable with people who stop performing for acceptance. When someone no longer needs validation to feel worthy, they become difficult to control. They stop participating in emotional games. They stop explaining their value to people committed to misunderstanding them. They stop shrinking themselves to protect fragile egos. And many relationships cannot survive this transformation because some people were attached to the performance, not the person. They loved the version that never said no, the version that tolerated disrespect, the version that remained emotionally available regardless of personal cost. But spiritually awake people eventually understand that losing relationships built on self-betrayal is not failure. It is freedom. This is why many awakened people become quieter over time, not because they have nothing to say, but because they no longer feel the need to constantly defend, explain, or advertise themselves. Their energy becomes more inward, more intentional. They stop broadcasting every thought, every achievement, every emotion for public consumption. They begin valuing privacy because they understand that healing requires protection from excessive exposure. Are now noise. The inner world becomes sacred territory. Their peace becomes sacred territory, and they start treating it that way. They become deeply aware of what enters their mind, body, and spirit, the conversations they entertain, the media they consume, the people they allow close, the emotional energy surrounding them. Because awakening increases sensitivity. Things they once ignored now affect them profoundly. Superficial environments feel heavy. Forced interactions feel exhausting. Emotional dishonesty feels almost physically uncomfortable, so they retreat sometimes, not to isolate from humanity, but to reconnect with themselves. Because spiritually awake people know something most of society forgets. You cannot build a peaceful life while constantly violating your own nervous system. And over time, they stop needing external proof that they are valuable. This is one of the most powerful transformations awakening creates. They no longer depend on applause to feel real. They no longer chase visibility to confirm worthiness. They no longer need to win every misunderstanding. There is tremendous emotional freedom in no longer needing everyone to understand you, especially when why, or finally understand yourself. And perhaps the most beautiful part of this transformation is that awakened people begin realizing how precious inner peace truly is. They understand now that peace is not passive. It is earned, protected, nourished through painful choices, through boundaries, through endings, through honesty, through walking away from environments that require self-abandonment. They realize that a calm nervous system is more valuable than social status, that authenticity is more valuable than popularity, that emotional safety is more valuable than attention. And eventually they stop grieving the loss of the image they spent years trying to maintain, because they discover something infinitely more meaningful beneath it. A life where they no longer have to disappear from themselves just to remain accepted by others.